I'm going to give a very brief overview of the IPC as a general introduction, just to situate it sort of in the global context at this moment in time when I think questions of famine are increasingly acute, where we are, I think, dealing with sort of major global issues. This is obviously persistent, but at the moment we are in this I think, important moment in time. I will close after 5 or 6 slides and hand over to my colleague Manuel, who will essentially give us an overview of some of the protocols for the classification of food insecurity, severity, and indeed how to build consensus. So that will be an introduction to the session. And then we're going to break off into these very closed groups where you'll have the opportunity to work with a senior analyst and facilitator who will take you through essentially a simulation. We've got a lot of time to do that, and something that we're very proud of in terms of setting up a new session, which we think will provide the learning that we're looking for. And after that, we will then come together for the final 10 minutes for a broad question and answer. We're really hoping that this is going to lay the seed in terms of an ongoing connection with you as an individual. And later in the year, in September, we're offering a level 1 training over 4 days. It's an opportunity for yourself to essentially become certified as an IPC analyst, with the future opportunity of perhaps contributing and participating in an analysis. So this is all part of a sequence of building this alliance that we are very much part of. So just in terms of how the IPC works and what it is. So it's a common global scale to classify food insecurity and malnutrition. I think this is very clear to all of you in terms of the readings that we provided, the e-learning course, but also in terms of the technical manual, which we shared. We focus on answering 6 questions, which are globally imperative. In terms of classifying food insecurity, how many people? How severe? What is the magnitude of that insecurity? Why are they insecure? Importantly, who are they specifically? Where are they located? And when? What is the moment in terms of their particular situation? So all of this is not just a snapshot in time, but it's essentially comparable over time. So we run these analyses globally, and we are able to provide these sequences in terms of being able for governments, for humanitarian agencies to be able to compare findings, to be able to track changes spatially, which is incredibly important when we need to be honing in and allocating increasingly scarce resources. So in essence, we are describing the severity of food emergencies. And that's why we raised that question right at the beginning in terms of classifying famine. It's a way of hooking you in to the session in terms of how we actually classify this. And this is probably the penultimate example of where and how the international community work in terms of being able to focus in on an area, to mobilize the resources, and then to respond. And we've built essentially a set of common standards and language with a 5-phase scale, which, as I mentioned, helps governments focus in on particular areas in partnerships and alliance with humanitarian actors. So you can quickly understand a crisis, a potential crisis, and you can act. I think that emphasis on action is very, very important. So it's not only in terms of the scale of severity that we provide, so in terms of whether an area is stressed, or whether it's in crisis, emergency, or ultimately it's in complete famine, but also we provide a framework for reaching technical consensus. Just that word consensus is increasingly important when we realize how contested, how political many of these situations are. So you're bringing diverse actors together. You are enabling them to follow a set of protocols so that ultimately this consensus can be reached, which then, in terms of commitment, enables that action. Very, very important in terms of following those protocols. Also provided are tools for communication and methods of quality assurance. So we are absolutely certain in terms of a process, when it is followed, that we can assure, we can guarantee in terms of the quality of that work that we're dealing with. So in terms of how it informs humanitarian decisions, it provides an immediate emphasis on the current severity of food insecurity in a particular area. So we are able to prioritize in a country the geographical, the administrative areas which need to be prioritized. We're also able to look ahead in terms of where there's going to be forthcoming severity of food insecurity period. So we anticipate within a period of time. And this obviously, in terms of this new focus on anticipatory action, allows us to mobilize resources for early action. Not so much ourselves, but in terms of the partners, those that are working with the IPC that are mandated to then act. And within all of this, we're able to estimate population groups or numbers in terms of the immediate situation, but also the projected situation by severity. So we're able to then look at population in need. So with all this classification, it's based on a convergence. Think about that word convergence. We're bringing together what available data is there and evidence, including indicators around food consumption, livelihoods, malnutrition, and mortality. Just if you think about the meanings of those words, just that importance of having a common language. Different agencies, different scholars, different groups have particular indicators which they would argue mean a particular thing. Here we are able to ensure that the integrity of those meanings are held, but in terms of following the process in that convergence, we're able to reach agreements and bring together essentially the best quality data and science that we've got. So in terms of how it works, and this is important in terms of the subsequent session that Manuel is going to take us through, there are 4 functions with 13 protocols. Definitely not going to go into the 13 protocols now. Those are in the reference table, which you'll be able to look at, but importantly also the technical manual, which we've shared with you. But in terms of those 4 functions, those moments that we follow through, we build that technical consensus. We classify the severity, magnitude, and key characteristics of both a place and the numbers of people in that place. We're able to communicate for action, and importantly, we assure the quality of that work. And here we're going to be essentially emphasizing the classification modality or function in terms of this particular session. And here, just to refer you to the reference table, it's something that is very important, and if anything that you look at in terms of that technical manual, to I think become familiar with that in terms of how what lies at the heart of the IPC. That's on page 35 of the reference table. Perhaps it's something you could look at afterwards. So just going into my second to last slide. So what is the process that we follow? So it's a month-long multi-step process led by countries. In other words, it's an invitation for the IPC to come into a country to then follow this staged approach. In the first instance, it's very much about planning. So here we look at what data is available, we map it, we gather it, we reanalyze it, and we organize it. So in other words, it's available for a team to then be able to use. We confirm and confirm its reliability. In other words, we understand that much data, much science can be up for question. In this instance, we're able to essentially look at the integrity of that data so that we are absolutely sure in terms of its viability and of bringing it together into a process. We invite the relevant partners within a country together so that they are able to engage those stakeholders. And where necessary, we build the capacity of the country partners in order to follow the process of the IPC. A lot of training happens. So this is the planning so that ultimately we move into the second step, which is in that preparation. So here, we're ensuring the analysts are adequately trained and that the requests for the external technical support, including communication support, are secured as needed. In other words, all that capacity or capability that we need to bring in is in place in terms of the preparation. And then importantly, we then move into the analysis. The analysis ultimately being communicated so that action can then follow. So in country, a technical working group convenes to undertake the convergence of evidence, something we're going to be doing today. They agree on the classification and the population estimates, as I mentioned earlier, that geography and that the population within that particular spatial grouping. We complete an IPC report, so in other words, something that's available to go out to the world. We ensure the communication products are in place and very quickly made available to a global audience and ultimately disseminate. And then something in terms of, and I think this lies at the heart of what the ANH is particularly interested in, it's the learning. So here the reflection and the review of the process ensures that there's constant self-improvement. We have teams situated all over the world that are looking at essentially the integrity, the assurance of are able to assure what is emerging. But we also continuously looking at concepts, at ideas, at indicators, so that we are at the crest in terms of much of the thinking, the global thinking around food insecurity and malnutrition. And here, technical working group members are required to essentially really reflect on some of the challenges that they may have encountered. So not only challenges of working with data, but in terms of reaching that consensus, so that also our facilitation skills are improved, that we are essentially making sure that we are following those processes where that consensus can ultimately be improved, so we can plan to address them. And my final slide. So why is this a global standard? Why is this often held up as that light in terms of enabling governments and humanitarian organizations and others to be able to work? So it's a powerful partnership. If you just look at in terms of some of those organizations from international NGOs through to UN, through to regional entities such as SADC, FuseNet, others, all of these coming together to engage, to commit, to be working within that partnership. There's a governance structure that sits at different spheres or levels. There's a global steering committee, which is supported by a unit that ultimately is reacting and responding to not only country needs, but essentially what the global steering committee may have in fact identified as issues. There's a technical advisory group, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is ensuring that integrity of what we're working with. And then within countries, national technical working groups that ultimately are part of, lead, invite that analysis that then follows through. And again, just to emphasize that quality assurance process. We are building capacity, undertaking training. This is the beginning of such a thing, which we hope many of you will follow through. We are offering real-time technical and facilitation support in process. And then there are other mechanisms which we have built in terms of ensuring the quality reviews. So that ultimately is an introduction, a very broad introduction. Much of what I've said is available not only in the technical manual, but also on the e-learning that is being made available along with our broader website. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Manuel, who's going to take us, I think, into the real essence of this learning lab. And as questions emerge, so we will collate them, and then engage with them either in this session or in the breakout groups. Manuel, thanks very much.
Thank you for the presentation, Scott. And before I start my presentation, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Manuel Veiga. I work for the Global Support Unit, which is the entity that actually provides support to all the Ipc analysis at global level. And together with me, I have another colleague that is going to introduce himself. We were expecting a third one among the team of facilitators, but he's having technical problems. But at least we have my colleague Ryan. Please, Ryan, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Freeman. I also work in the Global Support Unit of IPC. I'm a member of the Quality Assurance team. So as Scott was going through and explaining all the different roles of quality, my emphasis and main purpose and analyses is either facilitation or quality assurance. Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. I have prepared a presentation, and this presentation actually is meant to be a way of giving you the basic knowledge that you would need to engage in the exercise that we are going to propose you as the key aspect of this session. So don't take it as a training in the IPC. Actually, there is a standard IPC training that lasts 3 days, but this is only a few slides just to give you with the very basics. And right after it, I will show you which evidence we are going to use in our exercise, and then we will go into breakout rooms and start the exercise. So IPC, I am going to touch, but more from the technical perspective on several of the elements that Scott has mentioned in his presentation. He has mentioned that the IPC is a classification system. So it's true, we classify, or one of the things we do is classify the severity of food insecurity. What we classify the population of households in a given area. And the categories that we are using in our classification is what we call phases, IPC phases. So they are 5, and they go from phase 1 to phase 5. Phase 1 is called non or minimal food insecurity. Phase 2 is stressed. Phase 3 is a crisis. Phase 4 is emergency. And phase 5 is catastrophe or famine. Perhaps one of the most interesting characteristics about the IPC, as compared to other systems of classification, is that these categories, they have a description. They have a narrative that accompanies the category, which is actually a text that actually is, I found it very meaningful, explaining a situation that is easy to understand by even non-technical people. And we will be reading a little bit of the description of these phases. These analyses that Scott was mentioning, if I had to take the key outputs of this analysis, one is the Ipc Population Table. So in these tables, what you see is actually a distribution of the population of households across the 5 phases. And we do that for each of the areas that we have considered in the analysis. Usually these areas are all the administrative areas of the country. In some countries, we deal with admin level 1. In some other countries, we deal with admin level 2. That depends on the availability of information that exists. But basically, this output of the analysis is to allow the decision maker to see what percentage of population is in each of the phases. Related link to this output, to the reference table, we have the IPC map, which perhaps is the product that is the most known among the users of the IPC. This product is directly linked to the population table. So what you see here is a map of the country that has been analyzed, in which the areas that we have considered, they appear in the colors of the categories that we use for classifying in the colors of the phases. How do we come up with these colors? There is a rule called the 20% rule. And that rule, what it says is that you classify the area with the color of the phase in which at least 20% of the people is in that phase or in a worse phase. So for example, if you see an area here, color has red, phase 4, it means that 20% of the households in that area are in phase 4 or in phase 5, okay? So it's a way of establishing a priority, a geographical priority that is useful for decision making and to establish where to intervene first. So for example, according to this rule, when you see an area classified as phase 5, famine, it means that at least 20% of the households are in phase 5. Okay, so I'm telling you this because in our exercise, we are going to try to understand if we need to classify an area in phase 5 or not. So it's basically the question of whether 20% of the households are in that situation or worse, together with other protocols that I will not explain, but I will mention in an upcoming slide. So Scott has also mentioned that the focus of the IPC analysis, at least what we call the acute food insecurity analysis, is to support the decision-making processes that are related to the humanitarian response. Okay, there are other scales, there are other tools that the IPC offers. One is the chronic food insecurity scale, in which we try to inform processes dealing with long-term interventions, with interventions that try to address the structural causes of food insecurity. there is another scale on acute malnutrition, but the one we are going to be working on in this session is the acute food insecurity scale. It's also the most well known internationally. Is the one we use to identify famines, and as I said, is basically focusing on life-saving, livelihood-saving interventions. So because of that, the focus of this analysis is to understand what is the percentage or what is the total number of population in phase 3 or above. In the IPC jargon, this category is called phase 3 plus, okay? And again, it's a term you need to remember because we are going to use that in the exercise. So here is a zoom in on the description of the phases 3, 4, and 5. And I will give you an example of this idea of phases having a description, which I think is very useful for advocacy purposes, also to understand what are we talking about. And also in the analytical process, understanding the meaning of the phase is also very important. So for example, in a phase 3 situation, what you see is that households have food consumption gaps. And these gaps are reflected by high or above usual acute malnutrition. Or there can be another situation also pertaining at phase 3, which is that households are marginally able to meet minimum food needs, but only because they are depleting essential livelihood assets or through crisis coping strategies. In other words, they are able to escape from not eating enough calories, but they are doing that because they are destroying their livelihoods. Okay. Phase 4 is also presenting these two situations, but in a more severe manner. And in phase 5 is actually the most severe situation in which a household could be found according to this scale. And basically, the coping capacity has been exhausted, and the food gaps are so big that you start to observe death due to starvation at the area level. So our exercise is going to focus precisely on this phase 3 plus population. So I will be showing you some evidence, and based on our discussion and on what I am explaining now, I will ask you what percentage of households do you consider that are in phase 3 plus. So when I say 3 plus, I mean phase 3 or phase 4 or phase 5. By the way, this is a snippet from the reference table. I paste the reference table link in the chat. And what you see here below is a convention among the users of the IPC on which have to be the objectives of the interventions in each of the phases. So it's not really a response analysis or a recommendation on a specific intervention, but just on which should be the objectives of these interventions. So in a phase 3 situation, the humanitarian agency should focus on the protection of livelihoods and on the reduction of food consumption gaps. In phase 4, the focus should be to save lives and livelihoods. And in a phase 5, the focus should be to prevent widespread death and total collapse of livelihoods. Now, the question now is how households are classified in the different phases. So, and here also Scott has made some reference on the key aspects of the process. One is that these classifications are not done by one single individual or one single group of individuals working for one single agency. It's actually done by a team of analysts, and is done through a process of building technical consensus on that classification. This team of analysts has a specific characteristic. One of them is they don't belong to the same agency or organization, but actually they need to represent the wide spectrum of agencies intervening in the food security field. So the other characteristic of this team is that it's composed by experts in fields related to food insecurity. So you would want to have an expert in climate, you want to have an expert in livestock, another one in agriculture, or several of them, fishing, markets, livelihoods. So we need also people that knows very well the context and the livelihoods we are analyzing. So these are key characteristics of this team. If we don't have that team, we cannot call it an IPC. So it's really part of the protocols that this analysis is done by this team of experts. Another characteristic of this process is what we call the convergence of evidence. this idea of the convergence of evidence. I will explain that a little bit more in detail in the following slide, but it's basically that we need to use all available evidence that is relevant to understand food security, and we need to make sense of it, okay? Because sometimes the evidence is not saying the same thing, it's not pointing at the same message. So the work of the analysis team is actually to build that story using all available evidence. Also, to do this classification, we need to follow IPC protocols. The IPC provides a number of protocols that will guide the analysts on how to do this classification. In this presentation, I will just not even explain, but mention or refer to two key tools that are explaining these protocols. One is the Ipc Analytical Framework, and the other one is the Ipc Reference Table. Scott has also referred to it, and I paste the link in the chat together with the page number if you want to take a look at the reference table. And yes, I was saying that a famine classification is when we have 20% of the households classified in phase 5, but there is more to that. So there is also some special protocols that you need to follow in order to decide that an area is in phase 5. We will not explain those protocols. We are going to discuss on whether the area we are analyzing has or could have more than 20%. And in a real case, if that was the decision of the analysis team, then we will make use of those special protocols. So about convergence of evidence, it's actually a necessary approach that the analysts need to adopt to overcome what are the typical challenges that anyone analyzing food security is going to face. So the first most important one that you already know is that food security, the concept of food security, it doesn't have a golden standard to measure, that we can use to measure food insecurity. So there is no one single indicator that would allow us to classify severity of food insecurity just by looking at it in a reliable manner. Okay, so that's one characteristic of this concept of food security. So that what the consequence of that is that when we look at food insecurity, we end up analyzing a large diversity of data. So in a typical IPC analysis, you will have data about rainfall, data about markets, data about livelihoods, data about other climatic conditions, other shocks like earthquakes, like insecurity, like conflict. Okay, so it's really impressive to see all the different types of information that we need to look at in order to make the IPC classification. But of course, this data is never perfect. We have the data gaps. That's very often. As you can imagine, measuring this information in this type of context is not easy. It's very expensive. So data gaps are very common. So the analyst needs to actually to try to infer the information that is missing using historical information from nearby similar areas, or information from factors that determine the variable that is missing. Okay, and another challenge that we face is that in using this data, you have to take into account that the reliability is different. So there are sources that are very reliable because of the method, because of the time relevance of the information that is very recent. Others are less reliable because the method is not reliable, because it's an old evidence. So all these challenges that the IPC analyst faces, actually in order to address them, this idea of convergence of evidence, of bringing all the evidence together and try to build a story describing food insecurity conditions. And that story is built in a sort of iterative process. So I am an analyst, and so I tell you, okay, I think this is happening because I have this evidence, and that evidence is influencing this condition, and I tell my interpretation. Then I hear the interpretation of another one, or that person can tell me, yeah, but Manuel, you are forgetting about this other data, so I adapt my interpretation. So doing that in an iterative process is the process of convergence of evidence, and eventually will lead us to reaching a technical consensus. So a key tool of the IPC analytical process is what we call the Ipc Analytical Framework. Basically, what you can see in this framework are two parts, one part on the right, the other on the left. One part on the right is called food security outcomes. The other part on the left is called food security contributing factors. So this is basically what we are saying here with this analytical framework, is that every food insecurity situation, every food insecurity at its root is caused by an interaction of vulnerability factors and acute events. Acute event could be like a shock, a hazard, for example, a drought. And vulnerability are all the characteristics of the population that determines the exposure, the susceptibility, and the resilience to the particular shock considered. Okay, so that has an impact on the famous 3 food security dimensions, well, 4 food security dimensions. One of them is considered to be cross-cutting, this stability. So this interaction of vulnerability and acute events will have an impact on availability, on access, and household food utilization. Okay, and that impact is translated into outcomes that are seen at the food consumption, outcomes related to livelihood change, and these 2, what we call primary outcomes, also will result in secondary outcomes, which are nutritional status and mortality. Without entering into the details on which evidence do we use to analyze these elements of the analytical framework, it's important to understand that for the Ipc analyst, it's not only a matter of saying, okay, which indicators we have for the outcomes, and based on that, we classify. No, you need to build a story. So if you, for example, are observing that your food consumption indicators are telling you that there is a big issue, a great deal of the households are experiencing large food gaps, that on its own is not sufficient to decide on those classification. You need to say, okay, and why is this happening? So let's go to the dimension. Is one of the dimensions failing? And you may observe that, yes, that the prices of the food are very high, opportunities for generating income are not existent. And then if that is the case, you need to ask yourself, okay, but why? What is causing this? No? Then you would go to the upper left part of the framework and you would start to study, okay, but actually it makes sense that people don't have money because these people are living basically on agriculture. And it's true that I see rainfall this year and it has been a complete disaster. So actually they have lost their crops. So that's why they have no money because they could not sell their crops, etc. So you need to build the story. It's not sufficient to have information on the outcomes, but you need to cross, to triangulate that information with the food security contributing factors. Another important tool is the Ipc Reference Table. I have pasted here in order to make it big, just a selection of it. It's not the complete Ipc Reference Table, but I did it like that just to make you understand how it works. So in that reference table, what you have is basically a list of indicators or standard indicators that if you go to the internet and you search for the methodology, you can find it. For example, the household dietary diversity score. Okay, and for each of these indicators and each of the phases, you can see a cutoff. So basically, this is going to be helping you in comparing the value of the indicator that you have from your survey at the moment of analysis with the cutoffs that are described in this table. So if say I had an HDDS, household dietary diversity score, of 3 groups, for example, then I would go to the reference table and see that whenever I have 3 or 4 groups, 3 or 4 food groups, that corresponds to a phase 3. So I would say that HDDS is indicating phase 3. Okay, if, for example, I have a food consumption score information and I see that 10% of the households are borderline, have a score that is borderline, then I can say that that indicator is saying that 10% of the households are in phase 3. Now, saying that the indicator is pointing at phase 3 doesn't mean that the Ipc classification is phase 3. You need first to triangulate with the contributing factors, and also even if you based your classification solely on outcomes, as you can imagine, this situation I'm showing you here, that is basically showing a perfect convergence, is never seen in Ipc analysis. So it's, in other words, outcome evidence seldom converges. So having this a nice Ipc reference table doesn't solve or doesn't is not equivalent to say that you just need to compare outcomes and you will get the Ipc phase. So in this table I'm showing here, which is what we call a summary table of the outcome evidence. On the first column, you can see the acronym of a particular indicator from the reference table, what we call direct evidence. And these numbers are the percentage of households that were found in the different phases according to the reference table. Okay, so it's already digested for the analyst. So in this case, you can see that phase 3 is converging very nicely. No, the range goes from 20% to 26%. So you could say that the 25% or 23% of the households are in phase 3. Also for phase 4 and 5, the convergence is very good, and the same thing with the other phases. So I wanted to share with you this example has something which is the contrary of what we see. Actually, I had to make up this table. I didn't take it from a real analysis. So this is seldom the case that you see in a real analysis. What you see normally is this. Okay, this is a typical, and actually it's coming from a real analysis, typical summary table of outcome evidence. Okay, so once you face this, the work of the analyst is actually decide which indicator in which phase is telling you actually is giving you the accurate picture, and discussing that with the colleagues. By the way, you see that the last indicator, the GAM, global acute malnutrition, there is no number. It's because nutrition indicators in the reference table are area-based indicators. So actually, they don't measure the percentage of households in a given category, but it's actually the percentage of children under 5 that are -2 standard deviation. No? So what the Ipc reference table does is to, according to those possible values, tells you in which phase the area could be. So in this case, when I say GAM phase 4, and I put this star here, what I say is that the GAM information is telling that probably the phase of the area is phase 4, according to that indicator. So I think I have covered all I wanted to say, and I finish with this table because this is the table that actually you have seen in the evidence I have shared with you. Is the table that we are going to use in our exercise, and I wanted to insist that our work will be to decide which indicator is telling us the most accurate message, or which group of indicator, based on the story that we get from the contributing factors. I want to stop here now, and perhaps, Julia, I will allow a couple of questions on what I explained, and then I will jump into the presentation for the evidence. Well, I have a question from Diana Dalman. Let me go and open the chat for a second. Yes, Diana, that's correct. These Ipc protocols also, we have one protocol that actually explains which is the minimum evidence base that you need to classify. So once you do a classification based on that number and quality of information, of pieces of information, then you are set. You can do the classification. There is another question by Tanya Stahers, just to check the unit is the household. Yeah, inter-household. No, we classified households exactly. So we don't look at what happens within the household. Of course, that's possible, and perhaps Ryan, you can give some examples. But we try more and more, for example, to flag gender issues, which is a reality that is intra-household for the society, but also intra-household. And Ryan, do you have any experience on where haven't we done that to be able to indicate those issues?
Yes, I think there was just the recent analysis in Central African Republic, which had a gender aspect. So they were trying to look, at the household level, and then the distinguishing factors between male and female, elderly versus, let's say, disabled or younger populations. And I think this ties into the following question. It really depends on how the data is collected. If the data is designed and collected at a sufficient level, we can do this intra-household level analysis to some degree. But generally speaking, most of the surveys that you're going to get outside of nutrition are going to be household-based surveys. But yes, we do have experience doing this, so let's say an additional layer down. The most recent is in the Central African Republic, which I think is published. You should be able to find it on the website. Otherwise, we can go into more details afterwards.
Okay. And also from Tanya. Yes, so what about where food security situation has led temporary migration by some household member? Well, that's also a reality that we look at very often. No? In many countries, in many areas, one of the strategies of the household is actually to send away or the head of the household or some members of the household, they go away and look for work. So that's also taken into account as a sort of coping strategy, which if it's more than usual that the migration, then is something telling you that something abnormal is happening, or perhaps it's a seasonal migration, then you have also to take that into account. RCSI stands for Reduced Coping Strategy Index. It's an indicator, and I'm answering the question by Eric Unlorin, also in the chat. So yeah, it's a food consumption indicator. I will not go into the details on how that is collected, but if you type it in the internet, you will have the manual by Fund, I think. Another question. Yes, Ryan, you want to comment on that?
I was just thinking, as a good example, when they were talking about is the data on household food security collected by mobile phone surveys, this is done. And I think displacement is a very interesting case because we do use what is called a new arrival survey. So you can specifically target households that are displaced, either in their current location or after a displacement. And this can be done through mixed methodologies based on household face-to-face collection or computer-assisted telephone interviews, ACATI, which is currently done as well. So all of this is currently being done. It's available and it's pretty standard practice.
Okay. Ornella, yes, this data, the examples I gave you with all those acronyms in the tables, is data that we usually see in Ipc analysis. These are collected, for example, very often by partners of food insecurity, WFP, FAO, and governments in their seasonal surveys, in seasonal assessments. So you can see the use of that data very, very often. And these assessments also include sometimes also the fears. So this is this is used, and we, the Ipc, we use it to provide the classifications that you can see in our webpage. I think Ryan, also the Sophie is using the Ipc reports, right? So actually,
that's correct.
So Diana, what's the time frame used? What happens if some indicators have been assessed within different time points covering different time periods? Okay, this is related, Diana, to what I was saying about inference. So in our analysis, what we do is we provide, in the acute analysis, we provide what we call a snapshot. We say, okay, this is the situation of acute food insecurity for that reference period. Let's say in our exercise, it will be March 2021. It will be retroactive. We never do it retroactively. We do it either looking at the future or at the current period. No, current meaning at the moment of analysis. So when the evidence is not collected just before that reference period, the analyst needs to infer, knowing the seasonality, knowing, assuming also what factors can change situation. What they do is an inference. Okay, I think I need to move on. So Ryan, perhaps you can help me answering the remaining questions on the chat. You can help me with that while I try to present the information. Okay, thank you very much. I am going to present you. So let's jump to the exercise. Okay, and I said we have created a case. We have built a case which is actually a real case, but we have used a different name, so that it's not important to know where this happened. The important thing is that you get a sense on how this convergence of evidence goes and how this technical consensus is built. So the idea is that based on the review of the evidence I will be presenting now, and based also on your comments, on your views, on your observations and interpretation of that evidence, you will be influencing the other analysts. And we have set up a Mentimeter voting system. So hopefully what we will see after a couple of rounds of Mentimeter is that our vote gets closer. So the divergence gets reduced. That's my hope. Perhaps it doesn't happen, but the idea was to really show you how that process happens. No? So let me show you the information we have. We're going to be analyzing an area called Newton by. Okay. Newton by, and the objective of the exercise, as I said, is that you decide based on this evidence, based on your interpretation, based on what you hear from the others and from us, which is the percentage of households in phase 3+, meaning phase 3, 4, and 5. And then there is a specific question to see if we have also households in phase 5, which is a very particular phase because it represents like the most extreme food insecurity that you can find in the scale. So, by the way, these slides have been shared by you via email. If not, I'm sure my colleagues can share it in the chat right now. But basically, it starts by saying by describing the area. So Newton bites a semi-arid area. Rainfall falls between November and February. Majority of the population, about 80%, lives from agriculture and livestock, and also a very large number of, or a very large share of the population is also poor. This the agricultural activity is around the cultivation of tubers, maize, and legumes. There's a bit of rice too, and bear in mind also the maize is the staple food. Also, agriculture is a source of income. So actually, these agricultural activities, mainly around harvest time, are the main source of casual labor in the area. Also, livestock farming is another important source of income, but this activity is a bit conditioned by the insecurity that exists in the area. So there's a lot of thefts of livestock. The area is usually affected by shocks, namely drought, crop pests and disease, high prices of agricultural inputs, and insecurity. Also, when in a normal year, the households can create a stock of grain at home when they harvest, but the duration of this stock is very brief. It's 1.5 months and 4 months between those two limits, no, 1.5 and 4 months. Now, bear in mind also that for significant number of households, this can be even less, and in bad years it can be actually no food stocks whatsoever. And also bear in mind that the households, sort of cultural thing, but the diversification of their diet is very poor. So basically, they only eat 2 or 3 groups of food. Okay, so this is about Newton by. Also, we have had some information that has been collected. Well, this one has not been collected. It's actually provided by, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture or an agency knowing the livelihoods in the areas, which is the seasonal calendar. So if we are going to analyze March, see, in March, the harvest, well, there could be some green harvest, but actually the harvest starts usually in April. But March, end of March, some maize harvest could happen. Green beans not yet. That comes in June, and the harvest of cassava. Actually, it's a root. It's a tuber that they can collect for several months from October until February. The livestock activity, the sales of livestock, takes place mainly between the months of August to February, except for poultry, that can happen continuously. Okay. Also, there is some wild foods in the area, and these are collected from January to March, so coinciding with the rainy season. And as you see, the agricultural castle work is peaking around the time of harvest. So March is actually part of the lean season, as you can see. The lean season is this season in which there is more scarcity of food because prices tend to be high, and also the harvest has not arrived yet. On vulnerability, and I follow here the structure of the analytical framework. So this graph here tells you a little bit which activities would be more exposed to which hazards. So you can see that the typical income sources for the households are mainly casual labor, which comes from agriculture, directly agriculture as a source of food, also livestock and fishing as a source of food and income. So agriculture, fishing, and livestock is actually the main activity. So whatever shocks affects this is going to really have an impact on food security conditions of the households. Okay, there is also commerce, there's also formal jobs, there are a lot of poverty. So for many people, actually aid, chronically they receive aid to access food. So that's also an important share of the population. So you need to bear in mind this in order to understand if shocks will have or not an important impact. And the information we've got on shocks is basically, well, on COVID, because actually COVID for the last month has been something that is worrying the stakeholders in food security. But actually what you see is that the report from the households is that the impact on their revenue is not really important. So it has no impact for the 60% or more, 70% or 65% of the households, no impact, or even for some of them positive impact. Okay, perhaps in the forms of aid or who knows. But what is clear is that COVID is not really a shock at this time. On the right-hand side, what you have is the variation from average of rainfall. Okay, the title is missing. I'm sorry about that, but this graph here is rainfall anomaly. So that red line on the 100% line is actually the normal rainfall. And what you see are there are two indicators that are telling you the 1 month anomaly and the 3 months anomaly, and both of them are well below the average. So basically what this is telling us, and as you see, is below the average throughout the whole rainy season. So actually what this is telling us is that there was a lack of rain for most of the rainy season. Okay, the 1 month anomaly in January, February shows above normal, so it rained a little bit in January and February, but the accumulated one is really bad. More information on food availability when farmers were asked on how they see the perspective, the harvest for the upcoming harvest in April. They were saying that probably they are going to get 40% of what is normal. You see, so very bad harvest. But even worse, if you go below you see it's like an average of the variation that they expect, the farmers expect for different crops as compared to what they expected. So basically, in some of the cases, it's nearly to, like beans, for example, or cassava is like a total loss of harvest or production. On livestock also, it's interesting to see what the assessment says, which is that 55% of the households still have poultry, and 30% still have goat, and 15% still have sheep. But the red bar is telling you that there has been a decrease as compared to the previous season. It says 2021, but it should says 2020. Okay, so when you compare the percentage of households that had those animals in 2020 to the percentage that is saying that have them now, the decrease is very important. Like, for example, there's an 80% decrease in the case of poultry, and 75% decrease in the case of goat, and 60% in the case of sheep. So this is telling us perhaps that there is a strong decapitalization going on, right? They are less selling animals and they are not recovering the animals in the last year. And if we look at the food access, already more than 80% of the households are spending almost all of their budget for buying food. Also, these curves here tells you the price for the staple, for maize and for beans also, and you can see there is a seasonal high price. You see, so I think it's clear from the contributing factors that the conditions are not easy right now, are very severe in terms of shocks affecting key livelihoods, and that is reflected also in the perspective of harvest and also access to food, at least from the side of the price, is very worrisome. You see the prices, and I didn't put you the graphs showing how these prices compare to other years or to the average, but I can also already tell you that this is a sort of historical peak. On the other side, the agencies intervening in the humanitarian field, they have already to intervene in a massive manner. So you can see 30% of the households are receiving cash transfers in the period December to March, and in 20% of them are receiving food aid. And actually this, for both cases, food aid and cash transfer, the transfers represent about 65% of the kilocalories needs. So their energy requirement is being covered up to 65% by these interventions. That's a very important piece of evidence. So this is on the contributing factors. And then our summary table is the one I showed you in the presentation. So for the food consumption score, you see here that actually 90% of the households are in phase 4 and 5. And if you look at the last column, given that the question we want to answer is what percentage in phase 3 plus, is 98%, okay? Something weird is happening here with the HTTS, which is showing just the opposite situation. You see, actually this indicator is telling us 98% of the households are in phase 1 and 2. So you see, convergence of evidence is something that we need to build. It's not something that is coming directly from the summary table. HHS, household hunger scale, is showing also a different situation from the two above. Actually, it's concentrating the great majority of households in phase 3. which is very strange. Even phase 4, very, very few. RCSI would be more compatible with the above indicator, so it's compatible with HHS and FCS. But this indicator, RCSI, is a bit awkward because it's not a defining characteristic to distinguish phase 3 from 4 and 5. So it merges the 3 phases into one single category. LCS is an indicator of livelihood change. It's the livelihood coping strategies. So this is telling you that 71% of the households are engaged in what we call emergency strategies, which is the most severe form and extreme form of strategies that a household can engage in. So in some context, this is equating to selling your land, selling your household, to engage in prostitution, in crime. Okay, so this is happening in Newton Bay. And according to the latest nutrition assessment, the situation, as per the nutrition indicator, will be like a classification for the area of phase 4. So if it's a classification of the area of phase 4, it means that more than 20% of the households are in that condition or worse. By the way, the data relevance is very good. So this is from the previous month. Again, there's a mistake here, sorry. I put February 2022, but as I said, we are analyzing conditions in 2021 March. So this information is from the previous month, February 2021, okay? So I stop here. I think it's time now for going to our breakout rooms, and in that place we will deal with all the questions related to the evidence. Okay. So Julia, I think we are ready, unless there is anyone that wants to say anything.
Yeah, great. I'm going to move everyone automatically into 2 different breakout rooms, so you'll be assigned into a breakout room with either Ryan or Manuel.
Thank you. All right. So Julia, we have now 10 minutes, right, for questions and answers. So, well, I don't know. I would invite whomever wants to comment on the exercise. Claudia, please.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I was actually in the middle of asking a question when we changed breakout rooms. Just following on what I had asked in the breakout room prior, I'd been asking about how IPC uses the outcomes and the indicators that were provided in the table to inform the IPC classification itself. And I had gone on to ask how you ensure classification consistency if the data input varies for the place or for the time that you're collecting the data. And I was just hoping to hear a bit more on that.
Yes, sorry, we didn't get to finish your question as we were just coming back to the breakout room. But I think this is an excellent question. I think Manuel raised a very interesting point earlier about when the period of data collection happens. If it is collected, let's say in the harvest, but we're going to be doing our analysis in the lean season, you would expect a deterioration of those results. So it's not a mathematical formula where we say 10%, 5%. If it's agricultural, maybe it's 30%. We really have that contextualization and discussion with analysts who work there, who know the data, maybe they've collected the data. So there is this seasonality aspect, which can come in on the outcome. So there again, if it's collected and it meets the reliability requirements, it's valid, it's using the standard module, we know that it meets the kind of the data quality check. From there, it's kind of open to interpretation and expert judgment on how much does it improve or how much does it deteriorate. You see a lot of analyses where you get data in the lean season and it improves going into the harvest. So you have a scenario which is where it's going to get better. Other times you have data which was collected in post-harvest and you're moving into the lean season, so you expect a deterioration. So you have those variations. It's quite common. Very difficult for sure. No standard that we use, but it's a very good question. Over.
Thank you.
And Ryan, by the way, in your group, were you able to converge positions after a couple rounds of votings?
I would say yes. I mean, the group can always come in and share, but so these are kind of our results. We did three rounds of discussion. So our very first discussion, we had, as you can see on the top here, a wide range of positions on both phases 3+ and also on phase 5. So we had a discussion on the indicators. There were feedback and comments from colleagues about certain indicators that didn't fit. Let's say the seasonality, HFA, or the comparison between some of the indicators. We did another round of voting and we got closer. And then we had another round of discussion. There again, different questions were raised, and we got more or less, I would say there's still one kind of vote that was not in alignment with all the rest, but I would say generally consensus was reached. As you can see it, even in the last two, they're very, very similar. And they had roughly the same number of votes.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? And I'm particularly interested to see if for you it's clear the process of interaction with your colleagues, analysts, and hearing their arguments and how that can modulate also your views. That's really core to the IPC Convergence of Evidence and technical consensus building. Do you have any comments or any questions on that?
If there's no comments from my group, they raised an excellent question that I would ask the other groups. How did you identify the phase and how did you put population numbers in? Did you just start plugging away, or did you guys have a process? This was the question that was raised in my group that we discussed for a little bit, but I'd like to hear maybe the other group and how did you identify the phase or put your population figures in? Because that was asked in our group and it's a great question.
Anyone from our group?
I think we did put the population figures in. We were looking at the, we didn't even look at what is the overall number of people. We're looking at the proportions of the population in those different categories.
Yeah, I would agree with Tanya. I think at least in our assessments of the different phases, we took a look at some of the individual indicators that were from the presentation, and it leads to something that was mentioned earlier in the plenary about how you need to have a minimum evidence base for the kind of classification. I mean, in the different rounds that we had a very diverse set of voting choices across around a sample of 8 expert opinions, and I think in there it's an interesting approach. But if you had certainly a bigger group, you'd find that convergence a little bit quicker. Especially if there's a strong onus and to explain why a particular view diverges quite a bit from the community average.
Claire, please.
Could I just ask what the results for the other group were? What were your percentages from the Mentimeter, just to see how they compared to our group? I didn't
prepare such a nice graph like the one but I can show you the last voting, which is the one I have, and I can tell you also that we were also converging quite a bit from as compared to the first voting. But here is the results. At least you can compare. So what was your result, Ryan? For the phase 5, the last voting was 7, no?
The last voting was 7 and around 55, 56. So that's
yeah. And then bear in mind that in our case there was this extreme vote here that actually we could not actually hear the person proposing that. We could have been good to hear it, but we found it a bit extreme or like an outlier, no? And perhaps this could go until 60 or. But from the dispersion of the vote point of view, we also improved, and it was thanks to the colleagues and their questions and explanations that you could see actually that the voting was getting closer. All right, so Scott, I don't know if I think you wanted to make some announcements. It's almost the hour. I would give it as closed this round of questions. Of course, we are available via internet, via email, to answer any questions you may have on the IPC and on this exercise. But I give the floor to you, Scott.
Thanks, Manuel, and thank you, Ryan, both of you. I think it was fascinating to watch the process unfold in each of the groups. So just to say that the IPC is working very closely in partnership with the ANH, and in terms of, in particular, building up a cadre of analysts. And we are offering 3 sets of trainings for level 1 analyst. So the ANH website will have this, all the details in the next week or so. So the first training will be between the 12th and 15th of September. Another will be offered between the 17th and 20th of October. And another will be offered between the 14th and 17th of November. And what happens is that these will be placed within particular time zones. They are a series of over 4 days. It's between 4 and 5 hours per day. Possibly some days will be 3 to 4 hours. Very intense, but at the end, the opportunity is to come out in terms of, with that training, to be then eligible to be able to participate further with the IPC in a genuine analysis. And we're really looking to build this kind of partnership. So to look out for this, if you've enjoyed this, if you see its relevance, we really would like to draw you in. And certainly all of us are available to engage if you've got any questions and processes. And just to say thank you to Julia and your team, just in terms of the support, and just to note that the slides and the recording of the session are going to be posted on the website after the conference. So to look out for that. Yeah, so just with that, to thank you all for a really fascinating exchange, and Manuel and Ryan in particular. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to wrap up this session now, but again, thank you to our session chairs and facilitators, and for everyone for your questions and participation. Please visit our website at anhacademy.org if you're interested in any of the other learning labs that we're hosting this week, or also the research conference next week. So yeah, please check those materials out, and thank you again. Have a good rest of your day.